She was 24 and homeless. No room, no severance, no spare clothes, just a canvas tool roll, and $10 she had kept folded behind her driver's license for emergencies. And with that $10 she bought a forgotten wrought-iron cemetery gate forge in Orleans Parish, Louisiana, gone from municipal work maps since 1978. One roof truss had split above the coal bay. The west wall leaned far enough to show daylight. Orleans Parish condemned the structure on October 14, 2022, with demolition scheduled for the following spring. Beneath a rust-frozen scrolling jig lay a cast-iron cavity unopened for decades holding money, a silver leaf in a manuscript that would alter the shape of her life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Ines Moreau had been learning leverage her whole life without knowing it. She grew up in a narrow shotgun apartment where every broken hinge, loose drawer, and rattling window was repaired before anything new was bought. At 9, she learned that a screwdriver could become a pry bar if the pressure was gentle enough. At 12, she could tell by sound when a bicycle bearing needed grease. Nothing in the house was discarded merely because it had become inconvenient. Her father, Lucian, had worked nights loading freight until a damaged back made even lifting groceries difficult. He never taught her machinery, but he taught her patience. When something resisted, he lowered his hands instead of raising his voice. Ines remembered that more clearly than any lecture. The real instruction came from Lucien's older brother, Mateo Moreau, an architectural blacksmith who rented a cinder-block shed behind a funeral monument yard in Gretna. Every Saturday morning, while other shops were still lifting their steel shutters, Mateo let Ines rake the coal bed sort square stock by thickness and wipe soot from the scrolling forms. By 14, she was turning flat iron around fixed pins while he watched the color at the bend. Cherry red meant wait. Orange meant work. Yellow meant she had gone too far. He showed her how cemetery gates were built without trusting every joint to weld hot punch the first bar, upset the second pass one through the other, then collar the crossing while both pieces still carried heat. By noon, they ate cold biscuits on overturned buckets and listened to cooling iron tick in the silence. Mateo's sentence stayed with her because he said it only once. Iron does not obey force. It remembers where you gave it room. He meant that a curve survived because pressure had somewhere to travel. Ines understood years later that he had not been speaking only about metal. Mateo died in 2011 after a short illness that left his hands too weak to close around tongs. The rented shed was emptied before Ines could reach it. His Hammer's Fire notebook, bending forks templates, and the little silver leaf he once kept above his bench disappeared into an estate sale managed by people who saw old iron only by weight. She carried away nothing except what her hands remembered. At 24, she worked at Crescent Industrial Fabrication, beside the river trimming plate and correcting warped brackets on a hydraulic press. The foreman, Curtis Vale, measured a shift by minutes lost rather than work completed. He kept the fluorescent office blinds half closed and spoke through a clipboard circling bathroom time, glove replacements, even the 5 minutes a worker spent cooling a burned palm. When insurance premiums rose, he began moving names between departments as though people were interchangeable stock. On November 3, 2022, 13 workers found white envelopes beside the time clock. Ines's contained no severance check. Her rented room was 4 bus stops away. By the time she reached it, Mrs. Boudreau had dragged Ines's canvas tool roll onto the gallery and turned the deadbolt. A grocery sack held 2 shirts and a toothbrush. Rain had begun working through the paper bottom. $10 won't buy another night here, Ines. 8 words. Behind the lace curtain of the front room stood Lorraine Moreau, Ines' mother, who rented the smaller bedroom and cleaned 3 apartments for Mrs. Boudreau in exchange for reduced rent. Lorraine raised one hand to the glass, then lowered it when footsteps sounded behind her. She did not open the door. Ines picked up the wet sack, slid the $10 bill deeper behind her license, and walked toward Canal Street without knocking. For 6 weeks she guarded that bill as if it were a final rivet holding something together. The first nights were in New Orleans, sitting upright beneath the hard light of a 24-hour laundromat until the attendant began locking the restroom. She earned $7 helping a produce vendor break down crates, spent $2 on bread and coffee, and slept one night behind a church annex where an outdoor faucet still worked. In Gretna, she found shelter beneath the covered end of a public loading dock until security fencing went up. A day hauling scrap brought $11. Bus fare and food reduced it to $4 before sunset. She crossed back toward the city, then drifted through Metairie, sleeping twice beneath the broad concrete overhang of a closed furniture store. She washed in library restrooms, dried her socks under hand dryers, and learned which benches were divided by metal arms. In Kenner, a woman at a bakery handed her yesterday's rolls without asking a question. Ines swept the back step before leaving. Money arrived in ones and disappeared in quarters. She returned bottles, carried boxes, tightened a loose cafe chair for breakfast, and once repaired a bent handcart wheel with a borrowed adjustable wrench. Through all of it, the original $10 bill stayed untouched behind the license, flattened each night beneath her palm before she slept. On the 42nd day, cold rain drove her into the main library on Loyola Avenue. She chose a table near a radiator and opened the classified section of a parish surplus bulletin, because it was the only paper nobody else wanted. Halfway down the second page, beneath listings for seized shelving and obsolete office chairs, a narrow notice had been boxed in black ink. Abandoned trade property. Forge structure and lot. English Turn District. Condemned. $10 quit-claim transfer to qualified claimant. Demolition pending. She read it 3 times. The photograph was barely larger than a postage stamp. Even through bad printing, she could see a broken chimney, a sagging roofline, and the black curve of an iron gate leaning against weeds. Beside the doorway, half hidden under rust, stood the outline of a scrolling jig almost identical to one Mateo had taught her to use. Ines closed the bulletin and pressed both hands flat on the table. The $10 behind her license could buy 3 careful meals, perhaps 4. Or it could buy a door. At 3:17 that afternoon, she copied the parcel number onto the back of an old library receipt, walked to the transit desk, and studied the route south until the roads thinned near English Turn. There was no promise in the advertisement, only a condemned forge, unpaid taxes already cleared by the parish, and a deadline. She took the folded bill from behind her license for the first time in 6 weeks. The next morning, Ines Moreau boarded the southbound bus carrying 1 tool roll, 1 damp grocery sack, and the address of a forge that had been waiting in silence. The bus carried Ines past Algiers and into the lower river country before the driver told her the route ended 3 miles short of the parish road she needed. She stepped down beneath a sky the color of unpolished tin and walked south with the tool roll cutting into her shoulder. A farmer gave her directions at a crossroads, but no ride. By dusk, she had covered nearly 9 miles, much of it along roads without sidewalks, and the temperature had fallen to 38 degrees. She slept that night in the open end of a hay barn after asking permission from an old man who never gave his name. He pointed toward a clean patch behind the stacked bales, left a wool horse blanket on a nail, and disappeared into the house before she could thank him twice. At dawn, frost had silvered the ditch grass. Ines walked another 5 miles before the river bend opened, and a modest strip of businesses appeared near the road, Gautreaux Hardware with green-painted doors. Doris's River Cafe beneath a striped awning, St. Clair Feed and Seed with burlap sacks stacked in its window. Bergeron Pharmacy beside a boarded tailor shop, and Landry's Tire and Tractor under a corrugated metal canopy. Nothing looked prosperous. Nothing looked abandoned either. The parish clerk's annex stood 2 blocks farther on a low brick building with narrow windows and a flag snapping above the entrance. Inside, the air smelled of copier heat and floor wax. A woman behind the counter was fastening documents with a brass clip while reading through rimless glasses that sat low on her nose. Her left index finger was permanently crooked at the middle joint, and she used it to hold each page flat before turning it. The brass nameplate on her desk read MRS. Evelyn Bell Property Records. Ines gave her the parcel number. Mrs. Bell read it, then looked at Ines's grocery sack. "You came for the forge." "Yes, ma'am." The clerk pulled a thick folder from a lower cabinet and placed it between them without opening it. "You understand the roof has been condemned." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there is no electrical service." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the parish guarantees no safe water." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand demolition proceeds if you abandon it." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Bell studied her face for several seconds, then opened the folder. The deed was 3 pages long. There was no hidden clause, only an as is quitclaim transfer responsibility for stabilization and a requirement that visible safety work begin before March inspection. Ines signed where the clerk marked 2 small X's. Then she placed the $10 bill on the counter. It looked smaller there than it ever had behind her license. Mrs. Bell smoothed it once with the side of her hand, issued a receipt, and pressed a heavy brass county stamp into the deed. The mechanism came down with a clean mechanical certainty, embossing the papers so deeply that Ines could feel the parish seal from the reverse side. "You'll take Patterson Road east," Mrs. Bell said. "Pass the drainage canal left at English Turn Road, then continue until the pavement narrows. There's an old cemetery wall on your right. Your lane is just beyond it. No sign anymore." She gathered the copies but stopped when she reached the signature page. Moreau. Ines waited. Mrs. Bell turned the deed toward herself. "You're people from Gretna. My father was. What was his name?" "Lucien." The clerk removed her glasses. "And Mateo Moreau." Ines felt the room become very still. "My uncle." Mrs. Bell leaned back. The crooked finger rested on the parcel number. "My husband's mother had gates repaired by a Moreau. Years ago. Cemetery gates near Lafayette, number 1. Small man, burned cuff on his left sleeve, never wore gloves unless he was carrying cold stock." Ines almost smiled. That was him. Mrs. Bell looked toward the closed records room behind her. This forge belonged to the Arnaud works before the city stopped contracting with them. Mateo came here asking about it once. Must have been 20 years ago. What did he want? He asked whether the old bending equipment was still inside. Ines lowered her hand onto the deed. "And was it?" Mrs. Bell shook her head. "Nobody had entered safely enough to inventory it. I told him the same thing I'm telling you." She slid the stamped papers across the counter. "Careful is not the same as afraid." That sounded enough like something Mateo might have respected, that Ines folded the deed slowly and put it inside her tool roll. Mrs. Bell opened her drawer to make change from a payment that required none. Instead, she paused, looked at the $10 bill, and placed it beneath the wooden cash tray rather than into the daily deposit envelope. Ines did not notice. Outside, the wind had shifted from the river. She followed Patterson Road until roadside drainage gave way to broad wet ground and stands of live oak. A mile beyond the canal, a man repairing fence wire lifted 2 fingers from his pliers as she passed. A brown hound beside him barked once, considered her, then returned to smelling a cypress post. Farther down English Turn Road, 3 walnut trees stood in a row where an old property boundary had nearly disappeared beneath vines. Their bare limbs rattled lightly overhead. Beyond them, through a break in yaupon and cane, Ines saw the cemetery wall. The forge came into view 20 yards later. It was smaller than the newspaper photograph had made it seem, perhaps 36 feet long and 22 wide, built from dark brick on the furnace side and weathered cypress boards along the workroom. The roof was corrugated metal laid over older framing with one section sunken between rafters. A narrow brick chimney rose from the north wall, its upper courses missing enough mortar to resemble loose teeth. Above the double doors hung the remains of a wooden sign. Only 3 faded letters remained legible beneath moss and rust stains. A.R.N. Ines stood in the lane for a full minute before crossing the weeds. The front door resisted at the bottom. She put her shoulder against it, stopped, then remembered Mateo's hands. Instead of forcing the panel, she knelt and cleared packed mud from beneath the threshold with a broken strip of metal. The door opened 6 inches, then 12. Cold air moved outward, carrying coal dust, damp wood, mouse droppings, and the sharp mineral odor of old iron. She entered sideways. Her boot touched something hollow, and a length of rusted flat bar rolled across the floor with a metallic scrape that traveled through the building. Light entered from holes in the roof and turned suspended dust into pale columns. The front room held a workbench warped at both ends, a rivet header, 2 broken tongs, and the dead basin of a coal forge filled with gray clinker. She ran one finger over the bench. The dust beneath was black, not dirt, coal. In the back room, rain had found its way down the west wall. White fungus feathered one baseboard, and the floor gave a soft complaint under her left heel. She shifted her weight immediately and marked the board with a piece of chalk from her tool roll. Somewhere above, a pigeon moved across the rafters. The wing beats startled flakes of rust loose from the roof. She could hear the river only faintly, a low working sound beyond trees and levee. At the rear of the workroom lay the scrolling jig. It was larger than Mateo's, a horizontal cast-iron plate nearly 4 feet across, bolted to a stone base and crowded with removable pins frozen beneath decades of oxidation. Spiral channels had been machined into its surface broad, near the center, tightening toward the outer curves. A broken length of iron remained wrapped halfway around one form as though the smith had stepped away before finishing the bend. Ines touched the cold metal. Her fingertips came away orange. There was no electricity. The hand pump outside produced brown water for several strokes before clearing enough to wash with, though she did not drink it. Near sunset, she swept one dry rectangle of floor with a bundle of reeds, spread the horse blanket over her grocery sack, and ate half a roll saved from Kenner. The temperature indoors fell with the light. She lay on her back, wearing both shirts, coat folded beneath her head tool roll against her ribs. Through the broken roof she could see one narrow strip of night. The forge clicked and settled around her. Cooling metal. Loose boards. Wind crossing the chimney throat. For the first time in weeks, none of those sounds meant that somebody was coming to make her leave. Before sleep, she reached into her coat and touched the stamped deed once, simply to make certain it was still there. What survives is not what stays rigid, but what learns where to bend. On the first morning, Ines began with water. The hand pump stood 20 paces behind the forge beside a cracked concrete apron. She removed the rusted cap, poured in 2 cups from the bottle she had carried, and worked the handle through 43 strokes before the leather cup inside caught suction. Brown water came first, then cloudy gray, then a clear stream cold enough to ache against her fingers. She boiled it before drinking. The outhouse leaned south, but its floor was sound, and she reset the door hinge with one straight nail salvaged from the workbench. By the third day, she knew the forge by its noises. The board beside the chimney groaned under her right foot. 2 planks near the rear wall answered with the hollow note. The boards around the scrolling jig did not move at all, even when she drove her heel down hard. She marked weak places in white chalk and walked between them as carefully as stones in shallow water. Food became the next problem. At Gautreaux Hardware, she found a narrow aisle of stovepipe lamp wicks, mason jars, and bins of fasteners sold by weight. The owner stood behind the counter sharpening a carpenter's pencil with a pocket knife. Henri Gautreaux was a broad man in his late 60s with one pale eyebrow divided by an old scar. He listened without interrupting while Ines explained the deed the chimney and how little money she had. When she finished, he placed the pencil beside the register. "You need heat before you need pride. I need both, cheaper than usual." His mouth shifted not quite into a smile. He opened a ruled ledger. "I can give you 30 days. You miss the date you tell me before I have to ask." Ines looked at the empty line where her name would go. "I don't know what I'll have in 30 days. Then don't promise what you don't know." He pushed the ledger toward her. She signed. Her first account contained only what could keep the building from defeating her immediately: a 6-inch chimney brush for $8.75. 40 feet of polypropylene rope for $3.20 and stove cement for $4.60. A galvanized coal shovel for $5.95 and a small box of cut masonry nails for $2.40. Henri added an old paperback called Repairing the Working House and wrote no charge inside the cover. The chimney consumed most of the next day. Ines tied the round wire brush to the rope, climbed only as far as the roof framing she trusted, and fed the brush downward from the chimney crown rather than trying to work from below. The first pull jammed after 4 feet. She lowered it again, twisted a quarter turn, then pulled in short strokes until a slab of creosote broke free and crashed into the firebox. For 5 hours, she worked that way. The soot came down in dry scales, greasy flakes, and one hard lump as large as her fist. She wore a damp cloth over her nose and kept the clean-out door open. When the brush finally moved from crown to throat without resistance, she inspected the flue with a mirror and daylight. 2 mortar joints had opened, but there was no collapsed brick inside the passage. She sealed the worst gaps with stove cement and waited until morning. The first fire was no larger than a dinner plate. She laid newspaper beneath pencil-thin kindling, added 3 pieces of dry pecan fallen near the lane, and watched the smoke hesitate before rising cleanly into the throat. When the draft held, she added 1 small coal shovel. The forge room changed slowly. Damp iron warmed. The chimney began making tiny expansion sounds. She heated water in a dented saucepan Henri had found beneath his counter and cooked rice with half an onion. Doris had slipped into a paper bag at the cafe. Ines ate sitting on an overturned bucket. Steam touched her face. For several minutes, that was enough. The following morning, she began taking stock of the workroom, not as an owner, counting possessions, but as a mechanic, trying to understand another mechanic's decisions. There was a 4-pound cross-peen hammer, with the handle split neatly along the grain. A pair of long wolf-jaw tongs lay beneath the bench, one rein bent but repairable. 3 hand-cut scrolling forks hung from square nails on the wall. A fire rake rested behind the tuyere pipe. 6 iron templates each, shaped like a different leaf, had been wired together beneath a shelf. A hot punch with a mushroomed head stood in a wooden block. Beside it was a narrow swage with channels sized for 1/2-inch and 3/4-inch stock. Then there was the scrolling jig. She spent most of this afternoon removing debris around it. The cast iron plate measured 46 inches across and nearly 4 inches thick at its outer edge. Its spiral grooves were not decoration. Each radius had been laid out to guide flat bar through progressively tighter curves while limiting the point where the heated iron thinned. 3 removable pins had rusted permanently into their sockets. A 4th, moved only after Ines soaked it in kerosene, tapped around its base and worked it backward with 2 locking pliers. Under the plate, the stone pedestal seemed ordinary. The sound was not. Ines struck the side lightly with the wooden handle of her hammer. Solid stone gave back a short dead tap. She moved 12 inches clockwise and struck again. The note rang longer. She stopped. Again. A faint chambered sound answered from inside the base. She tested the weight next. The scrolling jig could not be lifted, but one edge shifted less than 1/8 of an inch when she used a 6-foot length of flat stock as a lever. The opposite edge did not move at all. Something beneath the plate had been built asymmetrically. She cleaned the central hub with a brass brush. Under hardened tar and soot appeared a circle that had looked like part of the casting. It was not iron. Cedar, a wooden disc had been set flush into the center of the scrolling plate, darkened until its grain was almost invisible. Ines sat back on her heels. The disc had 2 tiny holes near its edge, spaced exactly wide enough for the tips of dividers. Her own tool roll held no dividers, but the old wall did. Behind the templates, she found a pair with narrow legs and a seized hinge. 10 minutes of oil and patient movement freed them enough to fit the holes. She turned the cedar disc counterclockwise. Nothing. She pressed downward and tried again. The disc rotated 1/2 inch. Then another. A thread of black dust rose from its edge. Underneath was a recessed iron ring. Ines hooked one finger through it and pulled. The central section of the jig did not rise. Instead, a rectangular panel beneath the outer casting released with a dull internal click, opening a seam she had not seen before. She fetched the coal shovel and cleared the floor around her before touching it again. Procedure first. Mateo would have approved. The panel weighed nearly 20 pounds. Behind it lay a dry cavity lined with cypress boards and sealed at the joints with black pitch. The first package was wrapped in waxed canvas. Inside were 2 forging hammers, both smaller than the one from the wall. One had a polished rounding face. The other was a narrow cross-peen worn smooth from decades of use. Beneath them lay a pair of bending forks, a hot punch, and 3 hand-filed chisels. The handles bore burned initials, MM. Ines did not move for a while. She traced the letters once with her thumb. Mateo's tools had not all been sold. He had brought some here. The second package held 6 lengths of flat wrought iron coated in wax and tied with cotton cord, each 24 inches long. The metal showed the faint layered grain of genuine puddled iron rather than modern mild steel. Tucked between the bars was a folded sheet showing test curves, hammer marks, and temperatures written beside them in faded pencil. The third bundle was a tin cash box. It had no lock. Inside currency had been separated into paper envelopes by denomination. Most were old bills but still recognizable as United States currency. Beneath them lay canvas coin rolls, each labeled in the same precise block handwriting Ines remembered from Mateo's fire notebook. She counted once, then again. The notes came first. $38,900. The coins took longer. There were Morgan silver dollars, Walking Liberty half dollars, Mercury dimes, and Indian head cents arranged by year rather than value. Alongside them were several later coins, proof that somebody had added to the cash over time. The total value written on the final envelope was $41,200. Her own count matched it. Exactly. At the bottom of the box lay a small, tarnished medal on a faded ribbon. Ines lifted it by the cloth, not the metal. The bronze disc bore an eagle and the words, World War I Victory Medal. A narrow clasp above it read Meuse Argonne. On the reverse, scratched carefully near the edge, was a name and a year. Etienne Arnaud de Dutuque. Under the medal rested a folded packet of heavy paper tied with black thread. Ines opened only the outer wrapping. The first page bore a title in iron gall ink, on flexible interlocks for funerary gates and permanent exterior work. Below it were drawings of pierced bars passing through one another without welds, collars upset hot around the crossings, stress lines divided through scrolls and leaves instead of concentrated at square corners. There were dozens of pages. Near the bottom of the cavity lay one final object wrapped separately in linen, a silver leaf, no longer than the first joint of her thumb. The veins had been chased by hand. Its stem curved inward exactly as Mateo's cemetery ornament patterns had curved, not because symmetry demanded it, but because the bend allowed the thin metal to survive pressure. Ines placed it in her palm. She remembered it above his bench. For the first time since opening the cavity, her breathing changed. There was also a letter, cream paper, 4 folds. Her name was not on it. No name was. She held the envelope against the light from the doorway but did not break the seal. Money could be counted. Tools could be measured. A letter required something else. By sunset, she had returned every object to the dry cavity, except the medal, the silver leaf, and the sealed envelope. She placed those 3 on the workbench, then carried a bucket outside and sat beyond the walnut trees where drainage water moved slowly toward the river. The sky had cleared. A tugboat sounded somewhere beyond the levee, low enough that she felt it through the ground before the sound reached her fully. She watched dark water gather reflections from the last light. Behind her, inside the forge, $41,200 waited beneath cast iron. She did not think about spending it. Not yet. She thought about Mateo's initials burned into 2 wooden handles, and the fact that years before his death he had stood in this building long enough to leave part of himself where someone patient might eventually find it. The sealed letter remained unopened through the night. What survives is not what stays rigid, but what learns where to bend. Morning came clear and cold enough to silver the pump handle. Ines returned to the workbench before lighting the fire. The envelope had absorbed no damp overnight. When she turned it over, she saw 3 words written beneath the seal in a hand she knew at once. Open when ready. Mateo had used the same square R and narrow W when labeling tongs in his shop. She sat down. The seal broke without tearing the paper. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then you were patient enough to notice what other people stepped over and careful enough to open something without breaking it. Those 2 qualities matter more in this trade than strength. My name is Auguste Arnaud. In March of 1977, Dr. Samuel LeBlanc at Charity Hospital in New Orleans told me that the weakness in my hands came from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. He gave the disease its proper name because he believed a man deserved the truth about the tool that was failing him. By summer, I knew I would not finish another full gait. Our shop began with my great-grandfather Etienne Arnaud, born in 1847 near Thibodaux, who came to New Orleans in 1868 and worked iron for tomb enclosures. His son Jules, born in 1872, moved the family work to English Turn in 1896. Jules's daughter, Celestine Arnaud, born in 1878, entered the forge as a young woman and kept the pattern books when her brothers left. My father, Henri Arnaud, born here in 1904, taught me the work at this same fire. 4 generations, 4 sets of hands, 1 floor. The trade closed on September 30, 1978. Since then, this room has held more than 30 years of silence. My grandfather's brother, Etienne Arnaud Jr., went to France with the American Expeditionary Forces and died after wounds suffered during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918. The medal in the box came home without him. We kept it because a working family keeps what cannot be replaced, even when it hurts to touch. If you mean to work this iron, remember the heat before you remember the hammer. For flat wrought stock, begin shaping near 1750 degrees Fahrenheit, while the metal is bright orange, not sparkling yellow. When punching a crossing, leave at least 1.5 times the bar thickness around the hole, or the shoulder will tear. For a collar, upset enough stock to make the finished wrap 1/4 thicker than the bars it binds. After the final bend, return the piece to a low red heat and let it cool slowly before the tar dip. Do not quench decorative scrolls merely because you are tired of waiting. The manuscript beside this letter records the interlocks our family used on cemetery gates where welds failed first. A bar, pierced hot and passed through another bar, can move a little without coming apart. A leaf can turn force into curve. A scroll can carry weather around itself instead of taking the whole burden at one corner. That is the inheritance, not the money, not even the tools. The inheritance is knowing that work may outlive the worker if it is made to give pressure somewhere honest to go. I put aside cash because whoever found this place would need time before skill. Use it for shelter materials, food, and patience. Do not spend it proving anything to people who were absent when the work was difficult. Your Mateo Moreau found me here in 2002. I was already a fine smith by then. He came looking for the old Arnaud scrolling patterns, and I showed him what remained. He understood them before I finished explaining. Years later, when his health began failing, he returned 2 hammers and several tools to this cavity and asked me to keep the silver leaf with them. He said someone younger might need to find their way backward before they could go forward. I do not know whether that someone is his blood. It does not matter. If your hands are careful, the work recognizes you. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Auguste Pierre Arnaud, November 28, 2008. Ines read the letter twice. The second reading took longer because she stopped after Mateo's name and rested both hands on the workbench until the grain beneath her palms became something she could count. When she finished, she folded the pages along their original creases, pressed them flat with the heel of her hand, and returned them to the envelope. Then she opened the back door. Auguste had drawn a small mark beneath his signature, a 4-petal leaf around a punched square. Ines found the same mark outside on the north corner of the forge, cut into a waist-high limestone block, half hidden beneath moss. She scrubbed it with her sleeve. The carving was shallow, but exact a maker's mark rather than decoration. Below it, almost erased by weather, were the letters AA and the date 1978. She stood there until the wind moved through the walnut branches. Back inside, she brought the small silver leaf to the forge. She did not place it in the fire. Instead, she cleaned an old whale oil lamp she had found beneath the rear bench, threaded a new cotton wick through its burner, and filled it with the little kerosene Henri had sold her for cleaning rust. The match caught on the second strike. A narrow flame rose behind cloudy glass. She set the silver leaf beside it. Light entered the chaste veins. That afternoon small things began arriving. Henri left a bundle of seasoned pecan beneath the eave and pretended it had been scrap. Doris, from the cafe, handed Ines a paper bag containing red beans, 2 biscuits, and a jar of chicory coffee, then turned back toward town before Ines could offer work in exchange. Mrs. Bell sent a photocopy of the old Arnaud parcel map through the mail slot, the useful drainage easement circled in blue pencil. The unnamed farmer from the road passed at dusk and set a bucket of well water beside the gate without entering. None of them stayed. No one asked what she had found. There is probably a kindness somewhere in your own life that looked small when it arrived: a meal, a ride, a tool loaned without paperwork, a door held open on a bad day. If you remember one, tell us what it was. Sometimes the smallest thing another person gives us becomes the piece we build from. That night, Ines wrapped Mateo's 2 hammers in the horse blanket and placed them beside her shoulder. The manuscript stayed beneath the workbench, the metal inside its linen, the letter under her coat. She slept with the old tools close enough to touch in the dark. The first snow came on December 6, 2022. an unusual 2 inches that softened the weeds and made every hole in the roof visible from below. Ines opened repairing the working house to the roofing chapter and read it 3 times before climbing anything. The forge roof measured roughly 36 by 22 feet. Allowing for pitch overlap waste and the damaged west slope, she figured 14 squares of shingles, 2 rolls of roofing, felt, and nearly 25 pounds of galvanized roofing nails. She wrote the numbers in pencil on a scrap of feed sack before carrying them to Henri. He checked her arithmetic without correcting it. Then he reached beneath his counter and produced a roofing hatchet with a leather-wrapped handle, polished dark by use. "My brother's," he said. "He's been dead 12 years. I can't take that. You can use it." That distinction settled the matter. The man who joined her on the roof was Emile Landry, 72, once a roofer before his knees ended the trade. He arrived with a canvas nail apron and refused the money Ines offered before she had even named an amount. "You'll pay me by listening." For 11 days they worked whenever the boards were dry enough to trust. They sistered the split rafter with sound southern pine, bolting the new member alongside the old rather than cutting history away. Emile snapped a chalk line so the first course would not wander, then showed her a 3-stroke nail technique seat drive finish. The hatchet face barely paused between blows. On the 4th morning, he touched one shingle with the edge of his glove. "That nail's proud." Ines lifted the hatchet. "Pull it." She did. By December 14, the last course was down. The felt lay tight beneath it, and the sag above the coal bay had disappeared without making the roof look new. Rain came that night. Ines placed 6 empty cans beneath the places that had leaked before. At sunrise, every can was dry. January belonged to brick. The chimney had survived from a distance because its outline remained straight, but up close, the faces of several bricks had spalled into shallow red bowls and mortar near the crown turned to powder under a fingertip. Ines removed only what had already failed. Sound brick stayed where it was. Henri found hydraulic lime in the back storeroom and told her to mix it with sharp sand and fire clay where heat mattered. For the upper exterior joints, she worked roughly 1 part hydraulic lime to 2.5 parts sand. Near the flue, she added fire clay at about 1 part to 3 parts of the lime sand mix, keeping each batch small enough to use before it stiffened. For 3 weeks, daytime temperatures stayed mostly in the 20s. Mortar could not be rushed in that cold. Ines warmed the mixing water-covered new joints with burlap and worked only on sections she could protect before dusk. She removed powdered mortar with a narrow plugging chisel to a depth of nearly 3/4 of an inch, brushed every joint clean, misted the old brick, then packed fresh mortar tightly from the back forward. Her bare hands went numb every 15 minutes. Gloves made the fine pointing clumsy, so she kept a tin cup of warm water beside the scaffold and stopped when her fingers stopped answering correctly. Emile came twice, said little, and showed her how to tool the joint, slightly concave, without smearing mortar across the brick face. On January 28th, she built a test fire. First kindling, then pecan, then a modest coal bed. The smoke lifted immediately. Ines went outside and stood beneath the chimney. A pale thread rose from the crown and moved east with the wind. Nothing leaked through the mortar. Nothing rolled back into the room. The chimney drew clean. The floors looked worse after the roof stopped leaking, because Ines could finally see what belonged to age and what belonged to neglect. Most of the boards were white pine wide-planked and face-nailed with hand-cut rose-head nails. She lifted only 9 that had rotted beyond strength. Underneath the joists were sound except for one short section beside the west wall, which she repaired with a sistered length of pine rather than replacing the beam. Henri located reclaimed boards close enough in width to disappear once worn in. For sanding, Ines rented a random orbit machine from Landry's for $14 a day and carried it back in a wheelbarrow. She began with 80 grit, not the coarse paper that would have erased the floor's shallow scars. The second pass was 120. The final pass was 220, slow enough that the old rose-head nails had to be checked by hand before every section. Dust found everything. She tied a cloth over her mouth and emptied the collection bag outside where the pale powder smelled faintly of resin when the sun warmed it. Then came oil. The first coat disappeared into the boards almost as quickly as she spread it. The second stayed longer. The third formed a low, even sheen. She waited 48 hours before moving the workbench back. The pine had shifted from dirty brown to dark honey, and in the oldest boards near the forge the color deepened toward mahogany. One morning she could not begin. Nothing had broken. No bill had arrived. The weather was clear. She carried her coffee outside and saw a great blue heron standing in the marsh drainage beyond the walnut trees, motionless except for the wind moving the narrow feathers along its neck. Ines sat on an overturned bucket and watched it for nearly an hour. Then another. She did no work that day. By evening the heron had gone and she was still sitting there. The next morning she returned to the floor. There were 8 windows in the forge. 3 had no glass at all. 4 were cracked from corner to corner. The 8th held one surviving original pane, whose rippled surface distorted the walnut branches outside. A penciled note beneath the sash dated it to 1788, older than the present forge structure and apparently reused from an earlier building. Ines left that pane untouched. For the others, she removed each sash, laid it flat and softened, old glazing carefully enough to save the wood. New glass went into a thin bed of Day P33 glazing putty. She pressed glazer's points at intervals around the frame, then rolled fresh putty into cords and tooled the bevel with the blade angled toward the sightline so rain would shed away from the glass. The sash cords had failed on 5 windows. Henri sold her 1/4-inch cotton sash cord from a dusty box. Ines fed each new line over the pulley attached the counterweight with a figure-8 knot, then tested the travel before replacing the access panel. One weight jammed inside the pocket because a dead mud dauber nest had hardened beside it. She cleared the debris with a piece of bent wire and tried again. The window rose. It stayed where she left it. By February 9, only the south window remained. Ines reset the lower sash, trimmed the last putty bead, and wiped the glass with newspaper. Outside, a chickadee landed on a bare walnut branch less than 6 feet away. The bird tilted its head toward her. Ines kept one hand on the sash rail and did not move. After several seconds, it flicked its wings and vanished toward the cemetery wall. She lowered the window gently until the meeting rails touched. For the first time since she had arrived, all 8 openings could close against the weather. The walls came last because plaster required a patience different from carpentry. Behind the failures, Ines found hand-split oak lath still carrying keys of old horsehair plaster. She left every sound section intact and cut back only to firm edges. Near the chimney her first 3 patches failed. One cracked through the center. Another released from the lath after 2 days. The third sagged before setting and had to be scraped away while still damp. Henri appeared with an old burlap bag. My father saved this for no reason. Inside was clean horsehair bundled and dry. Ines mixed it into lime plaster until the fibers separated evenly rather than clumping. She pushed the first coat through the lath, hard enough to form keys behind it, then scored the scratch coat before it fully set. The brown coat went on at roughly 3/8 of an inch and cured beneath damp cloth for 72 hours. The final coat was scarcely 1/8 of an inch floated smooth without erasing every irregularity. When the last patch beside the chimney had hardened, she ran her fingertips over the cool wall. These patches will hold another 100 years. The room gave no answer. It did not need one. By then, people had learned how to help Ines without making her explain herself. Doris from the cafe had silver hair clipped with 2 black pins and always smelled faintly of coffee grounds. Twice a week before dawn, she left a folded paper bag beside the forge door. Sometimes it held biscuits, sometimes beans, rice, or cornbread wrapped in wax paper. When Ines finally carried money into the cafe and set it beside the register, Doris pushed the bills back with one flour-dusted finger. In candles when the shop reopens. That was the arrangement. Caleb Broussard arrived one Saturday on an old red Schwinn, one trouser cuff caught in a bicycle clip and a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 17, narrow-shouldered with a cowlick that would not lie flat beneath his cap. Without asking permission, he began breaking storm-fallen pecan into stove lengths and stacking them beneath the repaired eave. Ines offered him $5. He shook his head. My mother said, "About your grandfather." My uncle. Caleb looked embarrassed. Him, too. Then he swung the maul again. Reverend Boyd passed on English Turn Road each morning at 7:15. He was a lean man with a polished walnut cane he did not seem to need. He never entered the forge uninvited. He simply paused at the lane, tipped his gray felt hat, and one cold morning said 4 words. "Keep these hands steady." After that, he returned to silence. The kindnesses accumulated without making a debt ledger. A bag, a stack of firewood, a lifted hat. None lasted more than a minute at the door, but the forge changed because of them. Ines postponed the cellar until February 11. The trap door behind the rear bench had been visible from her first week, but the steps beneath it looked slick, and the air below smelled mineral and still. She waited until the roof chimney floor and windows were secure before carrying a lamp down. 7 granite steps descended to a 12 by 15-foot room floored with irregular fieldstone. The cellar held no treasure. There were broken jars, 2 rotted coal baskets, and an iron rack whose lower feet had rusted through. At the center of the floor lay a dressed granite slab, smoother and more deliberate than the surrounding stones. The 4-petal leaf around a punched square had been carved into its face. Ines swept around it. She did not lift it. Some things could wait until she knew why they had been covered. When she turned to climb back, lamplight caught a straight edge beneath the 3rd granite step. An oak box had been wedged into the narrow recess no larger than a cigar case. Inside lay 1 brass key and 1 tintype. The key's bow had been shaped into the Arnaud leaf and square mark. The photograph showed a young woman standing outside the forge in the summer light. The roofline less weathered but unmistakable. She wore a long work apron and held a pair of scrolling tongs across one hip. Her face stopped Ines. The mouth was hers. So were the heavy eyebrows and the slight turn of the left eye when facing bright light. She turned the tintype over. Written on paper, pasted to the back, were the words, "Celestine Arnaud, daughter of Jules, age 25, summer of 1903. Ines carried the photograph upstairs and set it beside Auguste's letter. The brass key went onto a small nail above the mantel. She tried it in no lock. For the time being, not knowing was allowed. March loosened the ground. The last thin patches of snow withdrew from the north side of the forge. The drainage creek grew loud with rainwater, and walnut catkins hung pale green from branches that had seemed dead all winter. Ines read the manuscript every evening. She did not begin a cemetery gate that spring. The pages contained too much she understood only on paper, and she refused to spend old iron pretending otherwise. Instead, she chose 1 Morgan dollar from the cash and exchanged it through a collector for enough modern mild stock coal and consumables to practice. She forged leaves no larger than her palm. She punched scrap bars and split several at the shoulder. She bent scrolls, too tightly reheated them, and began again. Nothing was sold. Nothing needed to be. By April, her hammer blows had become quieter because fewer were wasted. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Ines completed her first full piece in the Arnaud manner. It was not a gate. It was a narrow cemetery panel, 30 inches wide, built as a demonstration of the interlock described in the manuscript. She forged the uprights from flat stock, hot-punched each crossing instead of welding it, and passed the horizontal members through, while the holes still held heat. At the center, she formed 2 opposed scrolls that divided load into mirrored curves. Above them sat a single, hand-forged leaf copied from Mateo's silver one. She rejected the first 2 versions. The third survived. When it cooled, she heated the panel again to a low red, let it descend slowly toward black, then brushed and sealed it with a traditional protective finish, rather than covering every hammer mark. She set it beside the forge door. Nothing about it asked to be admired. It simply held together. Inside, the building no longer looked abandoned. The white pine floor carried dark tracks where work boots passed. 8 repaired windows gathered winter light. The lime plaster remained slightly uneven beside the chimney. Mateo's hammers hung above the bench, not polished for display but maintained for use. The manuscript stayed in a shallow drawer lined with cotton cloth. Auguste's letter rested beneath glass only when Ines was not reading it. The scrolling jig had been cleaned but never painted. Its wear belonged there. The brass key remained on the mantel until a storm in early December brought down one of the oldest walnut limbs. Ines spent the next morning cutting the branch away from the lane. Beneath a patch of loosened bark on the trunk about shoulder height, she noticed a rectangle of green-black metal set flush into the wood. Time had grown around its edges. At the center of the plate was a keyhole. She returned to the forge. The brass key turned once. A narrow compartment opened inside the living tree. The cavity had been lined with sheet copper and sealed behind the plate. Inside was a folded 48-star American flag wrapped in waxed cloth and a note browned at the creases. The handwriting belonged to Celestine. July 17, 1908. My brother Etienne is in France now, and mother keeps his place at supper. Though no plate is set, I have folded this flag before it can become the thing they hand us if he does not come home. If he returns, we will laugh at my caution. If he does not let whoever finds it remember that he was a blacksmith before he was a soldier. He could draw a scroll freehand in coal dust. He could carry 2 lengths of 1-inch bar without asking for help. I hated sharpening punches and loved Sunday pears. War recordsmen by rank, a family should record the rest. Celestine Arnaud. Ines stood with the note open against the walnut bark. No fortune lay inside the tree. Only the things a government record could not hold. On November 11, 2025, she carried Etienne's World War I Victory Medal to Lafayette Cemetery, number 1, where one surviving Arnaud family tomb bore his name among those buried elsewhere. She went at 11 in the morning on the anniversary of the armistice. There was no ceremony. She placed the medal beneath the carved name for several minutes, then returned it to its linen. That was enough. The money remained mostly where Auguste had left it. Ines used the proceeds from only 4 collectible coins over those years, 1 for practice materials, 1 to settle Henri's original hardware account, 1 toward electrical inspection and safe rewiring, and 1 for the replacement of a failed pump cylinder. The paper currency and remaining coins went back into acid-free envelopes inside the lined cavity beneath the scrolling jig. She added a new envelope in her own handwriting. For the next one, she wrote no amount on the front. By spring, people began asking whether she repaired iron. Ines did not put up a website. Doris cleared a space on the cafe corkboard between a lost dog notice and an advertisement for pecan firewood. Ines pinned a plain index card there. Wrought-iron repairs, old methods when appropriate. Ask Doris for Ines. The first job was a broken garden latch. The second was a cemetery vase bracket. The third was one section of 19th-century railing whose previous weld had cracked beside the joint. Within 6 months, Doris kept a mailing list behind the cafe register with more than 40 names on it. Ines accepted only work she understood. The rest she declined. Nobody objected. Caleb returned one April afternoon carrying something long beneath an old quilt. I had grown broader through the shoulders. The Schwinn had been replaced by a dented pickup, though the splitting maul still rode behind the seat. "You need a sign," he said. "I have the old one. You have 3 letters. That's nearly a sign." He uncovered what he had made. The board was cypress hand-planed, but not perfectly smooth. Caleb had carved Arnaud Ironworks in plain letters copied from an old invoice Mrs. Bell had found in the parish archive. Below, that smaller he had carved, "Moreau and daughters." Ines read the last 2 words again. "I don't have daughters." Caleb shrugged. Neither did every man who put sons on a sign. She looked at him. I became interested in the grain of the board. Also, he said, seemed wrong to close it. Ines ran her thumb through the carved ampersand. She did not correct him. They hung the sign beneath the surviving fragment of the original one, leaving the old 3 letters visible above it. The words "and daughters" remained. That evening, Ines opened a clean sheet of cream paper. She had postponed this longer than the cellar. Auguste's letter lay to her left. Celestine's tintype stood against the lamp base. The small silver leaf rested between them. Ines sharpened a pencil, wrote the date, and began. "My dear one, whoever you are, if you are reading this, I hope you found the scrolling jig without forcing it. I hope someone fed you when you were too tired to cook. I hope you learned that an old building does not become yours when a clerk stamps a deed. It becomes yours slowly when you learn which board complains, which window sticks, which wall needs time before another coat. I found money here, but that was not the richest thing. I found instructions left by people who expected not to be present when they became useful." She paused. Then she added 1 sentence about Henri's ledger, 1 about Doris's paper bags, 1 about Emile's roofing hatchet, and 1 about a boy who carved daughters into a sign because the future required room for people not yet known. She did not finish the letter. There was no reason to. The forge was open the following morning and 3 small repair jobs waited on the bench. Years earlier, Mateo had told her that iron remembered where it had been given room. Auguste had written that a scroll survived by carrying force into a curve. Ines had needed most of her life to understand that neither man had been teaching surrender. What survives is not what stays rigid, but what learns where to bend. She folded her unfinished letter once and placed it in the cavity beneath the scrolling jig. Outside, the new sign moved slightly in the wind. The original roofline remained uneven. The brick chimney showed repaired joints. Walnut leaves gathered against the threshold each autumn, and every winter the forge required new attention somewhere. That was not failure. That was maintenance. Near closing time, Ines banked the coal fire, wiped the hammer faces with an oily rag, and set tomorrow's stock beside the anvil. The wrought-iron cemetery gate forge waits. It has always waited. Several miles away, Mrs. Evelyn Bell still worked 3 mornings each week at the parish clerk's annex. Her desk had been refinished once, but the lowest drawer remained difficult in damp weather. Beneath the removable wooden cash tray, behind old rubber bands and a brass paper fastener, lay one folded $10 bill. She had never deposited it. Sometimes when the drawer stuck, Mrs. Bell saw the edge of the bill and remembered the young woman who had walked in carrying everything she owned. She left it where it was.